So I did a certification, which should have led to something, which has actually taken me to kind of a void. Its meeting is now streaming live on everything. Great.
Yes, we are live now.
Yes.
Great.
I did a certification, which should have led to something, which has actually taken me to kind of a void. It's working.
It's working, right? Hello everyone to the Facebook Live of Mentor My Board. And due to technical challenges, just allow us 1 minute to formally start the Boardroom Talk series. And Bharti, till that time, you can introduce Bhavana to the platform and then I'll take up the introduction. Meantime, I'm just having some technical challenge. Let me sort it out, but we are live. So over to you, Bharti, for the introduction of Bhavana, and welcome Bhavana to this platform of Mentor My Board Boardroom Talk series. So over to you, Bharti.
Wonderful. A warm welcome, Bhavana. Okay, so once again, really thank you very much for accepting our invite, so warmly reciprocating and participating with us and coming on the Mentor My Board platform today. Thank you so much. I just want to introduce Bhavana Bindra, who's a director. Currently, she is the director on Metals India Limited, which is a public limited company which is into metals manufacturing, which is supplying, I think, for original equipment manufacturing. Is that right, Bhavana? Am I okay?
And suppliers, yeah.
So basically, I just shortly go through Bhavana's work profile. She has worked with DSM India Private Limited, which as a managing director of that company. With Cummins India, she was the vice president and business head of distribution, the distribution business unit. She had the unprecedented honor and privilege of driving the turnover up to a double-digit CAGR for the period when she was there as a vice president and business head. The 1,300 crore annual revenue in such a different field was primarily due to her efforts. She has also been the vice president and business head in the automotive business unit of the same company, Cummins India Limited. She has also worked as a business advisory with Boston Consulting Group and as a Boston advisory. I think she was, there was one other experience, yeah, Boston's Analytics, which is actually a very interesting experience which I had gone through. She was a vice president and business research and analytics, responsible for setting up and growing the BR&A practice for this startup, which is headquartered in Boston, providing solutions to corporations, financial institutions, and professional service firms in India and globally. Once again, welcome, Bhavana. What I found very interesting in your profile, other than the various achievements which I have listed here, is that you have been in a what we would consider a man-driven field, and you have triumphed and have such wonderful achievements to your credit. So I would love to, have you spotlight and showcase it for us. But in the meanwhile, Divya is back here, so I would want to introduce our founder director of Mentor My Board, and she would like to tell you a little bit about Mentor My Board itself.
Thank you, Bharti. And first of all, let me thank you, Bhavana, for accepting our invitation and coming on this platform to talk on the independent directors, the women directors, and most importantly, women as a leader. So let me just give you a brief background and to the audience as well, that Boardroom is a place where fortunes of great companies are written, and hence in the pursuit of bringing the best practices of boardrooms and best practices followed by eminent directors, independent directors, women directors, professionals like CEOs, CFOs, CS of the corporate India and international boards to you, we have come out with the interview series with directors and professionals and business leaders who have been guiding and acting as torch bearers for the corporates and the boardrooms. Now, let me take the opportunity to introduce Mentor My Board to you. Mentor My Board is a platform, a virtual platform, wherein corporate directors come together to learn, to network, to sharpen their boardroom skills, to get opportunity of serving on the companies to act as directors and also to get mentored by expert mentors on the areas of business, governance, finance, marketing, and strategy. We are on a mission to transform Indian corporate boards, and wherein we have a mission to have 1 lakh directors community by 2027. And we help directors who are continuously looking to sharpen their boardroom and leadership skills, upgrade their knowledge on the board governance through best practices, which help the companies they serve on to grow faster. Now, let me all tell you, we have been doing this boardroom talk series, and we have been getting such a wonderful response from you all. So thank you for continuously watching the boardroom talk series, and keep sharing, keep liking. So kindly do share, like, subscribe to this page, to the YouTube page, to the LinkedIn page of Mentor My Board. And today I, CS Divya Momaya, founder of Mentor My Board, invite our esteemed moderator, CS Bharti Iyer, who has 30 years of rich experience of insurance industry. And most importantly, let me welcome Ms. Bhavana Bindra, Independent Director of Metal India Limited and ASAL, a Tata Group company. And Bharti has already introduced. So over to you, Bharti, for further session ahead. Thank you. Bharti, you're on mute.
So thank you so much, Divya. Would love to kickstart this, Bhavna, with a short description of your journey onto the board, a much desired and much coveted position. So how were you selected? What was the trigger in your memory? What were the character traits which you felt, as well as the abilities? Short introduction about that, please.
Sure. Thanks, Bharti. Thanks for the lovely introduction. And you did mention about my role in the distribution business for Cummins India Limited. And actually, as part of our strategy for that business, we decided to get into last mile operations for the channel. And that was a company we acquired as Cummins India Limited. And that was my first experience as a board. So you were a principal, but then you also had a dealership, which was your responsibility. Of course, from a strategy perspective, the intent was to learn the last mile operations, also to be able to pilot and try out various initiatives, and of course to be able to role model for some of the other partners that we had. And that was the intent with this whole strategy. So that was like the first entity of which I became a director, and of course, consequently, would end up being the chairperson for the board meetings for that entity. So that was one. And then, of course, as I got introduced to boards within the company, I had this kind of curiosity and desire to also get on to boards outside of the company. And Cummins as a company really encourages its leaders to learn and develop and grow. So it was something which was what our even our CEO would support all of us on. And there was one anecdote that comes to my mind. I was talking to one of very senior directors in a company, and I asked him. I said, I'd love your guidance on what's the best way. What should it be that I should be building in myself as I look to get on to boards? And this person's very innocent response was, "Why would you want to do that?" Now, of course, I had a lot of reasons other than curiosity, and we'll talk about it as we go in this conversation. But then I said, "Why not?" And his response was, "Well, because you're a woman." And I'm like, I'm not sure I get this, because I've been part of organizations where gender diversity has been a big thing, and not just diversity but also inclusion, and that's
Yeah.
part of my journey.
Correct.
And this person said, it's because of the liabilities. And I kept thinking thereafter, how are the liabilities different for men and women? I mean,
Yes.
would it, for instance, for a child, would it be different if the father was found liable for something which maybe was discovered later versus a mother? And I mean, that's of course taking it to an extreme end. But the minute that was said, and the minute that struck me as a question, like I just don't get this, it
Correct.
was an initiation of a journey which of course I've had mentors, I've had people who kind of guided me through it. But yes, I did start my independent directorship thereafter over a couple of years, and you already talked about it. So just a little bit on my beginning journey on the
Yes,
director.
very nice. Actually, that anecdote brings it home to us, like still how far or how advanced we are in our thinking. That whether you want to have one on board and not just as a checklist because it's dictated by regulations. So very well, depicted by that example.
Yeah.
I would like to just ask you, because you were the head of distribution and vice president sales. So with regard to strategy, you must have had a plan that in the next 5 years, I'm going to make the CAGR develop, because it should not have been serendipity, in my opinion, with your abilities. So can you tell how important is it that a director who's on the board of such a challenging industry also should understand strategy with regard to the last mile distribution, or with regard to marketing as against sales? And if you're an independent director who's particularly like an engineer or as a lawyer, these aspects don't really carry that significance. You say, okay, this actually doesn't pertain to my field of operations, so let me just sort of tune out a little bit, and there are very worthy members of, I just want.
Yes, yes. Yeah, you bring up a very valid point, and that's where I think being a director, in my mind, a lot of directors, for instance, are business leaders or have been business leaders in previous avatars, depending on what stage of life they decide to become directors on company boards. And I think a lot of what we think as business leadership, BU, or legal entity leadership also kind of mirrors what I think directors need to keep in mind. Yes, it's important to have a great team, and I think finding the right talent is one of the biggest jobs as leaders. It applies to directors also, because you need the right teams managing the entity. Otherwise, you just, because as a director you're not running day to day operations. But then there are certain aspects as a director which again mirror as a business leader that one needs to keep in mind. And one of them, for instance, is the longer term or the strategy for a particular business. So it's not about you're just stuck with next month or next quarter's revenues, profitability, challenges. Yes, as a business leader you get into those, but then as a business leader you also need to keep in mind the longer term. As a director, that same thing applies. In fact, I would say the longer term or the strategy, the business plan, and the consonant risks associated, I think those are some things which directors need to push the envelope on. And to be honest, again, one of the fallacies which I sometimes see as a leader, and I'm sure I've been as much responsible of it, it's like, okay, this is my area of expertise and I'm going to focus on this. You cannot be like that, because as a director the assumption is you need to understand broader. You cannot just be in a silo and like not bother with the rest of it, leave it to the CFO or the finance experts or the engineering experts, because it kind of applies across the board. Anything and everything that you do impacts the organization, impacts the strategy, the financials. So yes, there may be certain areas you are more adept in, which is the reason why you're there in the first place. But then once you are there, it's not about switching off when the other areas are being discussed, which is where, and that's where I think organizations like yours can really help in expanding the scope and the learnings associated with directors, especially when they are functional experts and not necessarily people who come with very broad based, BU or entity leadership experience. So that's my thought on what you brought up from a strategy and what directors and business leaders should be looking out for.
Again, I'm muted. No, I was just saying, Bhavna, that's a very valuable insight, and we'll definitely be noting all these points as we go along. With regard to corporate governance, you have been a managing director, so I'm not talking with regard to the executive aspects of your responsibility and roles. When you come as an independent director, you will not be having that hands-on approach, and it'll be more of when you're an executive director, it's more like in the business, so in looking out. And when you're in an independent director position, it's more like out looking in, and it's very hard, having been in both the positions, to keep your fingers out of the pie, that micromanaging. Yeah, a lot of us do that. So how do you distance yourself as against that? You want to be the out looking in, so that you are protecting the board, because the board has the collective responsibility.
Yes.
Your
Yes, you're right. So, you're right. The temptation as somebody who's in the organization and on the board to get into the details is much more versus if you are outside. So you're right. When you are in, and I think that's so one of my experiences within the organization being on the board was to actually enable the team to look outside in, because the team is there looking at it day in and day out. And I needed to have or resist the temptation of doing the same thing. I needed to be looking at it outside in. And maybe it's kind of my BCG roots, or maybe my strategy experience thereafter. But yes, every time you look at a business, competition, market potential, where is the market or the consumer demand headed, those are some very basic questions which you cannot blame a CEO or a management team for missing all the time, because sometimes, especially when there are mature businesses and you're in the middle of them, it's
Right.
very easy to stop thinking about these on a longer term basis and be content with what you already know and what you think you are understanding of how things are moving. So there's one incident that I remember. We're sitting in a board meeting, and again, I'm kind of part of the organization, and just looking at the business, I remember going through a presentation on how market share was improving and how they were looking at introducing new products, so all good things. And there was a simple question on so what is competition planning to do over the next 3 to 5 years?
Okay.
And there was like pin drop silence, and it's like, yeah, I mean, what we know, what we know, what we don't know, we don't know.
No,
And I'm like,
correct.
yes, but let's just acknowledge what we don't know, we don't know, and that is important. And because it's important, let's make an attempt to know it, or to find somebody who can help us know it,
Absolutely.
right? And
Absolutely.
what I realized was the first reaction under those circumstances, especially for the team that's on it, is to go on the offensive. And then the more you probe, of course, there's a bit of a defensiveness. And those are dynamics which honestly sometimes get bound by hierarchy also. So it's not very straightforward. So, when we are independent directors, we think, oh, speaking up, and especially when you have really senior people in the room, could be difficult. Well, try being within the organization and then have hierarchies represented on the board, and then doing it. It's the same challenge as you'd have in a management team. How
Correct.
many
Ah,
people have the ability and willingness to challenge a senior, right? So this was one thing I always smiled about, that for people who've not been on both sides as directors both ways, they probably don't get this, that within the company the meeting can probably just run as if this is a business review kind of a thing. And but the point is, it's the same outside. If you haven't learned to speak up, you'll not learn whether you're within the organization or outside the organization.
well put. Really well put. That's why I was interested, because you have been on both sides. And
You
independent
caught me on
directors,
that
like,
one. I didn't realize I had that.
so you just put your finger on the pulse, what I wanted to have you say. With regard to women directors, what are your thoughts on, how women directors can be assertive? What you feel would be the importance of their role? Not everybody's, everybody talks about their being more attentive to detail, more meticulous in their planning, their ability to multitask. All these are the usual things which we hear about women directors. So I don't want to get that. I want to get a different flavor from you, because you have been in a very, man-centric industry. So with regard to that, and generally, I just want to get your thoughts on the importance of women directors, D&I specifically.
Yeah. So Bharti, it's a very poignant question for me, because I think uh, let's say about 15 years ago, even with the organization that I was working, this was precisely the discussion we were having in terms of representation in the organization,
Right.
right? And whether that was right out of college, whether it was middle management, or over the years, whether it was top management. What is it that the woman, I'll call it the woman, is bringing to the table? And I think all of us will recollect, decade or decade and a half ago, having these case studies, or these discussions around the business case for diversity. And
Yeah.
several of us would have, gone through that just to prove a point on how having more women. I think it's the same logic. It's just that we've gone bit by bit, as it's like when women are fresh out of college, they come into the workforce. Then we hear about dropouts at the middle level, further dropouts at the senior level. So by the time you talk about the board levels, which is generally, much later, or assumed to be much later, I wouldn't say much later, but assumed to be much later, it's the same leakage that happens in the pipeline. And so the whole thing around bringing in diversity on the board is about what value women are bringing in. And in fact, I would strongly always urge, if any of the women with our forum over here are invited to join a board, I think the question to ask is, why do they need me on the board?
Perfect.
And of course, the first simplest answer is because the regulation requires it, which is fair. Let's give credit to the regulation because it's obviously trying to overcome an age-old cultural and lots of other biases. But then there's another question. Is this the only reason that I have been chosen versus somebody else? Maybe getting somebody else will be simpler. Maybe I may end up asking too many questions. So why not somebody else? And the answer to that question will tell you what value you bring to the table. And believe me, if
Excellent.
that's not a good answer, unless you desperately need it on your CV, it's okay to not do it. Because if you're just brought in for a tick in the box, that's all you'll be expected to do, which is a tick in the box. And over a period of time, that doesn't feel good. So let's, make sure we keep that in mind. and
Very,
and
very
I
true.
think the whole thing around diversity, whether it's gender, or so for example in my case, I am not an engineer, and I've spent like more than a decade in an kind of the engineering
Engineering.
manufacturing industry.
Right.
And I think the entire thought process of the organization, that's obviously been very encouraging, has been to promote this whole mindset which thinks differently, which comes with a different perspective on things. And that's what is important for an organization's growth. Because if everybody is thinking the same way, there's not too many avenues in which we will grow. And I think that's a recognition which a lot of corporates are now having, which
Right.
is why there's a deliberate attempt to bring women into the
Right.
management. And
Right.
that same benefit is going to be seen on the boards.
I think that was a very wonderful answer. It served to illustrate so many points, the importance of diversity. Just because, diversity is not all about, having ripples. Those ripples actually cause refraction, which causes rainbows and which have lovely colors. And that's the most important aspects of what we bring to the board, women. So thanks, Bhavana. That was a lovely answer, really illustrated. With regard to, staying up to date, independent director specifically, because you are on boards of a maximum number of 20 companies. Okay. Maybe different companies, from the services to the manufacturing to the heavy industry, different type of boards. How do you think, how relevant it would be for them to be updated in all aspects of this? How do you choose a board to be in when you are invited to be on the board? Because like you said, you must bring value. You should not only be a checkbox, check mark, this thing that you're a woman and therefore you have been invited on the board. So if you are honest and you see what is your value add to the board and to the company in which you are being, then you would want to also upgrade your skills. So how important is that for us to take a reality check on our abilities versus where we have to be, And how do you feel that a director who's independent is invited to be on so many boards? What do they have to do?
Wow, Bharti, you asked like 5 questions in one question. That's an
Sorry.
amazing ability you have. So I'm going to try and see how many I'll answer, and then you can, remind me which one I didn't answer. I think so. I'll come talk about, staying relevant and, bringing value, right? So I think a lot of times, if you are not there to just tick the box, or let's say if you're there to tick the box and something else, so let's kind of acknowledge that part of the deal is that and something else is because you stand for something or you built something for yourself, and that something, it proves that you have the potential in you to bring in more, right? So depending on what stage of career and life you are at, like for instance for me, every opportunity of an interaction is a learning. It could be learning from a self awareness perspective, it could be learning. So for example, when I heard about Mentor My Board, my
Right.
first inclination, and I'm giving a very different example, was to just Google on how many such firms, forums exist within the country. And believe me, every time I asked a question, which I know Mentor My Board is helping to answer, there would be an international firm that would pop up as the top response to my search. And that is what amazed me. I said, okay, it seems like there aren't too many of the kind that Mentor My Board is doing. Yes, there are some, but honestly, you really need to look for them. And they make it sound like, oh my God, this is like another program and certificate, and like you sign up for it, pay the money, and we are done with it, versus something that really involves you. The reason I give this example is every time you're associated with a company, for me, it's an opportunity to learn that industry, to learn the entire interlinkages. And hence, for me, every meeting brings in a moment which then says, yes, this is what I have added to myself. Now, when you are a director, I realize everybody in the organization you're associated with is more than happy to talk to you and to share with you what's going on. And of course, in the process, also take your inputs on what can be done better, right? So for me, in my head, it's clear that I need to look for the information, I need to gain the knowledge. And when we talk about academics, for instance, so a lot of us are like, okay, do we do a course and we are good with it? The point is, when we are in academics, like all of us, when we did our college, everybody's trying to teach us through cases, through application. And here we are living in the applications, right? So why not just gain the most out of it? The point is, you need to be proactive about it. It's not going to come on a platter to you. So whether it is about reaching out to the organizations you're associated with, whether it is to connect with the forums those organizations are part of, or now we have so much information at our disposal, just getting into that and then asking the right questions. Sometimes the answers don't, like I said, fall on a platter, and even if you find them, you won't get them. It's sometimes about asking the right questions. So like somebody told me the reason they wanted me on their board was because I asked the right questions, and I'm like, thank
Yes.
you, that's an amazing skill to have. But yeah, that probably says I've been quite shameless about asking the questions I have. But I think that's something we need to always keep in mind.
Thank you.
So
Thanks
yeah,
a lot.
Bharti, I don't know how many of
Thanks
your
a lot for
questions.
mentioning that about Mentor My Board. So it's amazing. And Divya would like to.
Good. I mean, when you really said, Bhavna, that you could not find, too many organizations like Mentor My Board when you Googled, I mean, that's really something what I was thinking when I started this journey, when I started experimenting, and I, started realizing, because first thing was I got myself certified as a director, and I wanted this space to know more, hota kya hai. And when I really went deeper into it, and I realized there is a huge gap between people who are extremely good directors already on boards and lot of masses who don't have any hand holding available to them, except there are few organizations who have been working. But again, there are challenges. And din numbers, agar hum dekhen, 65 lakh din numbers have been taken in India, and if you see, the trained pool of director is not even 65,000, so less than 1%. So thank you so much for bringing this point out, and yes, over to you, Bharti, for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said in the beginning, no, that we find it very difficult to find organizations which literally give you support. So thank you for that, Bhavna.
I
Uh,
think
with regard- sorry.
one thought that comes to my mind, and maybe Bharti, you were planning to cover it later, but just don't want to lose it.
Correct.
I think the whole thing about what is needed when you are starting your journey as a director and what is needed once you are, kind of a little bit into the journey. Those are two very separate things, and the learnings in both need to be very different. The other, of course, is what does it take to begin this journey? So for me, that entire gamut, I think with everything I understand about what you are looking at, and that's important. How do I get there? What do I need to know when I get there? And what thereafter?
Nice. Yes. So I'm just going back. I think the video is frozen, but anyway, I'll just go back to the question. Bhavna, I just wanted to ask you your thoughts on risk management because you've been on different boards uh, and business continuity planning because pandemic has really brought such a stoppage of work. So how important is independent director be up to date on risk management? What are the risks attacking any organization in which he's a director? How does he have to be, on constant touch with the board and with the rest of the people, without being again micromanaging?
Yeah, I think, so the pandemic is something which, I mean, given that in our births or most of our births, we hadn't seen another, it was not something we were really planning for. But having landed in the middle of it, there's a lot of things people took away from it. Having said that, I think from a board perspective, uh, there's the whole provision around the risk committees, right? uh, I just think I've seen various or rather varying degrees of processes on figuring out risk and proactively dealing with them or proactively having the plan to deal with them. And it kind of differs organization to organization. The good thing in my mind is that yes, there's the provision of the risk committee. The not so good thing is in case you do not have a risk committee, how proactively as a board are you driving towards the whole risk management piece? And do you have the right tools and processes, or let's say benchmarks or best practices at your disposal to be able to drive the risk management processes, right?
Right.
So a lot of times, and I'm going to give an example, it's like if I'm a business leader, somebody will come and say, so what do you think are the risks in your business? And it's like anybody who's in the middle of the business will have like 10 things, but it's probably that 11th thing that's going to cause me a problem later. So the question then remains is how well equipped are boards with frameworks that help them devise what are the risks that need to be looked at across their whole set of operations and what could be possible mitigation plans. And I think that's something which currently is a lot dependent on how well versed the directors as well as management are. And of course nobody could predict the pandemic, so it's just the learnings we can take away from that. But how well can you deal with them or have a process to deal with them? So that's something which is what as directors we always need to watch out for. And I'm sure organizations like yours can definitely help that kind of a process to be put in place so that people can refer to best practices and benchmarks on that.
Right. Yeah, the ability to look around the corner, and that's very important for independent directors because they are the out looking in, and we are so engrossed in our own daily processes that we don't have the ability to look around the corner and see what's going to come and hit us.
I
Probably.
think the good thing is, especially the advantage of having independent directors who are across organizations and in some case also working full time with organizations is that, sometimes a a particular management team is like at a loss. It's like, I wish I knew how others are dealing with this. And
Correct.
that's a big role for independent directors. I mean, of course, without giving away confidential information, there's a lot of learning you end up taking across organizations, which of course makes them the best practices.
Yes, and wonderful directorial inputs, from you. I'm sure that we are taking the notes to develop this aspect for our mentoring and coaching as well. With regard to work-life balance, just wanted to know your thoughts on how important is it. What are the contributions you made despite of this or in spite of this?
Yeah. So work life balance, as a full time employee and an independent director, work life balance as an independent director, work life balance as a full time employee. I think all those three sit on the spectrum of unbalanced work lives. so there's no, the way I always looked at it was, life's gonna remain unbalanced. You just need to be clear on what's important. And what's important is not like an either or. There are basket of things which, so I'm giving my example, so it's not like I'm kind of expecting everybody, but for me it's like there's a basket of things that are important to me. The only thing is, in that basket I may pick up something one day and I may have to pick up something another day, and by the way there's a third thing and I have two hands only, and in that case I need to choose what I'll need to pick up that day, right? The only piece here is my intent with my energy and enthusiasm should not be any less, right?
Yes.
And once that is clear, people also understand, or at least when you do it with the consistency that comes with delivering results, people get it,
Oh,
right? So
nicely
for
put.
me, there's not a good answer on work life balance. It's fine.
So it's a purely subjective answer, and I wanted it, and you have answered it very well. Actually, very nicely put that last one. What do you think about the disruptive forces which are impacting an organization? We already covered that to some extent on risk management, and with regard to any companies where you have served as a director, any particular disruptive forces and anything which you have contributed, whatever comes to mind.
Right. So I think disruptive. So at least in the time that I have managed businesses or been on boards, I realize, disruption has been like a, regular thing. It's not like, one day you woke up and something happened, or in this 1 year, this has been really awful. It's something you've kind of learned to live with because, I would say it's the kind of time and age we are in, where something or the other is moving at a pace which requires organizations to keep up or to actually think ahead. So for example, I mean, let's just say take this whole example with the pandemic, and the whole thing around working remotely, work
Yeah.
from home, right? Now, I know there are several organizations in, different industries, which, for example, until date were relying, for instance, on the last mile to be having information on customers. These organizations, when they see that months together, there is no other way to get work done except online, decide to take the whole KYC online,
Correct.
right? Now, look at the opportunity this creates for the organization. They actually have this whole ton of data, which until a certain point in time was residing with people for whom this was their life. Now, of course, those people need to be upskilled because otherwise they become redundant, since all that information which was their power has suddenly become available to whoever has access to the system for the organization.
Right.
At the same time, there's this whole opportunity because they become available and you can upskill them to do other things. And because data is at your disposal, there is so much you can know more about your customer, which otherwise would sit in files with people, etc., etc. Right? So for me, and this is an example from, a different industry that I was talking about. It's the same thing applies to the traditional industries, right? The whole geopolitics, the way it's happening, I mean, there's just so much opportunity that can probably come our way. The thing is, how agile are we to take on those opportunities? And I think as a board, those are things which you can't let go, because obviously there's a management which needs to work on next month, next quarter, etc., like I said earlier. But then there is this whole piece on, okay, where are these opportunities opening up given the way dynamics are working geopolitically, and then push them towards, so what is needed for that, what resources can we bring at your disposal for that, and how best can you exploit that opportunity. And I think that's the kind of thinking or the limit boards can expect or should be expected to push.
To be
Because
expected.
otherwise, for a CEO, for instance, or for a CFO, it's like the whole whatever 5 6 months since we've been in this, these trying times, is just about managing the next salary, the next order that needs to be executed, or bringing in or get the collections going. And I think that's where the board brings in a lot of value, that while you manage those, let's not lose sight of these opportunities.
Correct. Very well said. That is the most important, that bird's eye view, a slightly clinical approach, because we are not right in the thick of things. We can afford to look out and think and, give some good deliberations to the executive level people. Uh,
Right.
to disruption, everybody always thinks of it as a very negative thing. Like just now, we have always spoken also. But in the IT industry, for example, disruption is considered as the catalyst which helps you to set up better practices, think beyond, think outside, think on a different plane altogether, like IoT, or for example now artificial intelligence, and more than that, augmented intelligence. So how important do you think that today's director has to be? I mean, it's too archaic now to say tech savvy, so we'll have to think of some other word. But how important is it? Like, you can't keep saying that, I can't do this, I can't do that, because I'm challenged on Excel sheets, and I'm challenged on this. So how important, in your opinion, besides financial literacy, uh, the other important thing is, being cyber savvy. So what would your thoughts be on that?
Honestly, I think versus a generation that started, life online just the same time they started using the pen and paper. It's, I mean, we are talking about, several generations that coexist,
Right.
including in the boardroom. At least I can say, in my understanding, there could be three generations that can coexist, right,
Right.
in the boardroom.
Yeah.
And to me, it's important to have the basics sorted. There are certain things which, of course, if you don't know, you end up becoming redundant. So, in order to stay relevant, you need to move on with the times. And I wouldn't say that I'm totally adept at it. It's like my social media example. I have been a very recent entrant. I mean, I've always been there, but like no clue on what I needed to do with it. Versus, I said, okay, it's high time. I may not be as savvy, but I need to know. So I think it's about what varying degrees of
Hmm.
this savviness are we expecting directors to have. There's some which is basics, but then there is this whole extreme end, which I think the more you know, the more you can add value to the organizations. Otherwise,
Yes.
they end up being in the same, well, frogs in the well is a very extreme analogy, but you end up being in the same mode.
Correct.
And the more you know, the more you can apply. It's like this example I used to give my team when I used to have run the distribution business, where I used to say pizza can be delivered in 30 minutes. Why can't the service engineer reach within an X number of minutes to the customer location when required? I'll use the same example. And if we are talking, like you gave the example of the IT industry, with several things, why can't we bring them into the traditional sector, or the so-called assumed traditional sector? And I think there are a lot of companies which are trying that. There are a lot of companies which have pioneered that. So not being savvy enough is never an option as a board member.
Yes. Yes. Very true. I think you've answered almost all the questions in my mind very, very truthfully, very 360 degrees with all the, the masala as well as all the meat which we wanted, that you should do. So thanks a lot, Bhavna. I would now invite Divya to ask a few questions.
Hi, Bhavna. Absolutely thrilled to listen your conversation, both of you, and Bharti. Wonderful questions and absolutely wonderful answers. Here, I would like to tell you, Bhavna. I have been talking to a lot of people, a lot of women. Especially we have a women directors group wherein we keep interacting a lot of things. We have coffee meets, coffee sessions happening. To bring out more and more women to come out of their glass ceilings of the limiting beliefs and all those stuff. So what's your say on to a woman who aspires to reach a boardroom, because now institutes have started training their professionals on the directorship. IICA has started examinations. So a lot of fresh blood is coming into the system who wants to be independent director, who wants to be director, but they're clueless how they get those board positions. At the same time, what are the qualities they should have? So if you can just quickly say what are the top 3 or 5 qualities you think every woman should have to get that position. At the same time, how really they can think of getting the positions.
Sorry, I had muted because there was noise behind me. Um, I think the first and foremost, and I based this on an example with a friend, um, who kind of said, "Hey, how do you get on boards?" So I'll answer that first, and then talk
Yeah.
about what I think could be a few things we can keep in mind. How do you get on board? And when the question came, I said, okay, let me like kind of frame my thoughts on what you need to do, or let's say what I did, kind of a thing. And then she said, oh, I know so and so, I know so and so, I know so and so. I said, okay, you know so and so, so and so, so and so. So have you told them that you're interested?
Exactly.
And she was like, no. And I'm like, so how exactly are you expecting them to even imagine that this is something you want to do? Right. So I think, I don't know if it's a woman thing, but I think in some cases it's gender neutral. But I think the intent or the interest needs to first be known by folks who can make it happen. And which brings me to the other thing, which is, there are a lot of people out there who are willing to mentor and who are willing to guide. uh, we just may need to make sure, again, these people know the intent and know what it is. So because it's one thing to be in getting in a board, it's another to be bringing value to the board, right? Because being, your first board position may be about, okay, who referred you where, or did you get hunted through a headhunter for it? But the point is for you to continue there. And if this is a journey you want to take beyond just that one that you landed with, it's about being clear on what value you bring. And I think that's the whole thing around, whether it's a thought process, whether it is about a skill that you have or an area of expertise, to have established yourself in that particular piece. So, a skill, an area of expertise, but be clear on what it is you bring to your table. Because believe me, if you are not clear on what you bring to the table, the other people will definitely not know. And it'll come back to the same thing we were talking earlier, which is like, you're just a tick in the box. And when they need a tick in the box, they will reach out to you. And you cannot be a tick in the box forever. It doesn't work that way. So for me, that's important. I think always making the intent known and being clear on what value I bring to the table. The third for me, which is, it's a, I'm so sorry about that. It's a question that keeps on my mind. One is what value I am bringing to the table. The other question is, what value is this bringing to me? because there has to be some learning I need to bring. In the same way, like this interaction has brought me something, there needs to be some learning, because a day wasted without learning is not worth it, right? So you need to be clear on what it is. So if you're joining a board, you need to be clear on what you are getting out of it, right? Is it an industry understanding? Is it a certain particular technology advancement that particular company may be promoting? Is it about doing an IPO for that company? Whatever it may be. I mean, there could be like a ton of things that you can think of, but there needs to be something that you are going to add to yourself with that assignment.
Wonderful. Absolutely wonderfully.
Especially the third point. Yeah, thanks. Really insightful. The first two, of course, I expected it from Bhavna. The intent has to be made known. You have to be assertive. You have to make known that you want to be on a board. But the third point, what is the learning from me? And absolutely singular thought. Very nice, Bhavna.
Absolutely wonderful. So here we would come to an end because it's already 7 o'clock, and we would come to an end with this interesting talk. I know, there are so many questions we really want to ask you, and that can go on and on, but time is a limitation. We'll, look forward for some different topics, some interactions with you, very soon. But yes, thank you for being here with all of us today and making this 1 hour so useful for so many people. And when I tell you women, I mean, believe me, I have been talking to a lot of people and everybody has a similar question, and you answered it very well, that selecting a right board for you is equally important, that what value you are going to get, at the same time what value you're going to give. Very well, and that's my take off from today's session. So thank you everyone. Thank you,
Thank you so much,
Bharti,
Bhavna.
for this wonderful interview. Thank you, most importantly, Bhavna, for taking
Bhavna.
out time and having you on this platform. That has really added value to MMB, to Mentor My Board. And I'm sure these insights, a lot of women, a lot of people, a lot of men, they will take back to their boardrooms, to their organizations. And, I always believe if you want to be the change, I mean, if you want to see the change, you be the change. So, that's where we are trying to do something different, which not has been done in India so far. And thank you once again to everyone, and let me thank our viewers here. Thank you for watching this boardroom talk series continuously with us, and keep watching, keep sharing, keep liking the boardroom talk series. And also, most important thing is, keep giving our suggestions to us. And if you want someone to be invited, just type in the chat box and we will make sure that we have that person on this show for you all. So thank you everyone, and thank you, Bhavna, for your presence today. Most important. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much for
Enlightening.
the
Thank
opportunity.
you.
I really enjoyed our conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you.